Hello, I'm Carrie.
And I'm Emily, and we are the voices of Tarbis.
What's Tarbis, I hear you ask? Well, Tarbis is a blog that we do together where we visit historical houses or places of historical import and we blog about them, basically giving our opinions on the place, how well it's presented, facilities, things like that, and sandwiches, because we love sandwiches.
And that is in our name. But we decided that we wanted to do another medium. We wanted to do a podcast to talk more in depth about lots of different aspects of history, not just the specific era of the place that we're visiting. So we will go from the Stone Age to Victorians, inventors, monarchs, everything here, and you'll hear some of our opinions and what we think, and possibly some debates.
Indeed, and we would encourage you as well to get in touch. You can leave reviews, or you can contact us through our blog, just to see what you think, or if there's any particular people, places, events, things like that you'd like us to talk about, we'd be more than happy to do that.
Yep, so sit back, relax, and enjoy Tarbis After Hours. This week, it's a bit of a history mystery. There's a lot of controversy about this chap, and whilst we'll try and be as factual as possible, some of what we know is steeped in intrigue and a lot of propaganda. Also, we might be slightly biased on this one, though we will try and be objective, as always. So, without further ado, let's talk about a gentleman, nay, a king. He was born in 1452, died in 1485, but buried in 2015.
Ooh, who could it be?
Ladies and gents, Richard III.
Woo! I'm kind of excited about this one.
I thought you might be.
Yeah.
You're a little bit more biased than I am.
I am a little bit. I'm a bit
Just
of
a
a
tad.
nerd on this score. Right. So let's get some of the facts that we know 100% out of the way. Okay. He was born on the 2nd of October, 1452, at Fotheringay Castle in Northamptonshire. His dad was Richard, Duke of York, and his mum was Cecily Neville. York was actually cousin to the then King Henry VI of the House of Lancaster. He was House of York, Henry was House of Lancaster. They're all kind of interrelated through Edward III and on. Okay? Together, Richard and Cecily had 12 children in total.
Wow, they got jiggy.
Yep. It was her job and his prerogative.
She did her job well.
She did her duty. They had, in age order, Anne, Henry, Edward, Edmund, Elizabeth, they like the letter E, Margaret, William, John, George, Thomas, Richard, and Ursula. Ursula sadly died young. All the others survived into adulthood.
Okay. That's good back then. 11 children surviving to adulthood.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, that's not counting any that died in infancy. We don't know too much about those, but these ones we do know. When the tensions between the houses of York and the reigning House of Lancaster reached a climax, known as the Wars of the Roses, and that's just because of the general sigils for both houses. Like Lancaster had the red rose, York had the white rose. Wars of the Roses. Also known as the Cousins' War because they were all cousins. Things didn't go well at first. There were a couple of battles. It was tit for tat really, and then Richard, Duke of York, was killed along with his son Edmund, who was then Earl of Rutland, at the Battle of Wakefield on the 30th of December 1460. You could say Richard of York gave battle in vain.
Really?
Yes. Anybody in England who studied the colours of the rainbow will know that.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I paid attention in school.
We discussed saying that joke before we started, and I didn't think she was actually going to do it, so I do apologise.
If there's a pun, there's a way.
So, at this time, Richard was 8 years old.
Little Baba.
Yeah, and he and George were sent to the Low Countries, Belgium and the Netherlands.
Yeah, because it was part of the Kingdom of Burgundy at that point,
yeah.
I think. Or Dukedom, sorry.
So, after the York victory at the Battle of Taunton, they returned to England to participate in the coronation of my bay, Edward IV. This was in June in 1461. That was when Richard then became the Duke of Gloucester and George became the Duke of Clarence. Richard was also made Knight of the Garter and Bath.
So he was knighted at the age of 8.
Yes.
So, the Battle of Taunton is actually still, to this day, the bloodiest battle fought on English soil.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
That I didn't know.
Thousands died, and it was at the point where people just kind of left after the battle in the field, and people would go out and pick their bodies clean of armour, of rings, of little bits here and there. That's why there's not a huge amount, or as much as you'd like, of archaeological evidence there, because people would nick it just to say they'd been there, and the ground was pretty much drenched in blood. So yeah, that's it's quite a daunting fact there, isn't it?
It is really, considering all the battles that happened, especially during the War of the Roses.
No, that was the worst. But back to Richard.
Yes. So not only was he only 8 years old, and he was now the Duke of Gloucester and a Knight of Garter and the Bath, he was also appointed the sole Commissioner of Array for the Western countries when he was just 11 in 1464.
Commissioner for the Array. Do you have any idea what that means?
Somewhat, but because Richard is your forte, I will let you go ahead.
To array means to gather your forces. So if you were to array an army, you'd get people from like your local land, your local tenants and things like that into your army and recruit them. That's why a lot of armies were local peasants, and each landowner, each lord would have an army that they have arrayed. And
so at 11 years old, Richard was in charge of getting an army from all of the Western countries.
Basically, yeah, he was the commissioner. So if he commissioned you to array an army, you had to do it on the king's orders.
Wow.
So his word was straight from the king. So if this little 11-year-old kid just kind of strolled up to you and went, I want 500 men from your farmstead, you got to give him 500 men. Even if there are 500 men, you find them.
But he was 11?
He was 11, yeah.
Wow.
Pretty ballsy for an 11-year-old.
Tell me about it.
Yeah. But because he was still young, he needed an education.
Well, yeah.
And he was actually fostered by Richard Neville, the 16th Earl of Warwick, a.k.a. the Kingmaker.
Oh, that Warwick.
That Warwick. And we should be coming back to him. Interestingly enough, you'll be hard-pressed to find more than one image of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick.
Oh.
Because after his death, which we'll come on to later, they basically scrapped all of his images. They wanted to get rid of him because he was a traitor.
They were pretty pissed at him.
Understandably, I get that. I mean, whether you support him or not, you can get why they did it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but at this time, he was still in with the Yorkists, and he had a castle at Middleham in Wensleydale in Yorkshire, and Edward, who was then King, Edward IV, your bay, he paid him £1,000 for looking after Richard Neville, and he stayed there kind of intermittently until he was 16 in 1468, and that's where he met his future wife, Anne Neville, who was actually Warwick's younger daughter. He had Isabel and Anne.
Yeah. And so, like we've just said, obviously something happened, and when Warwick and Edward fell out, the two were separated, and George, who was already married to Isabel, so George, the elder of the two brothers, so he wasn't older than Edward, but he was older than Richard, he had already married Isabel. So, because of this, he joined Warwick's side. Yeah,
he wanted to be king, didn't he?
Yeah. So he thought that if I stick with the Kingmaker, he's done it once, he'll do it again. And because of the fallout, Edward actually opposed Richard and Anne marrying.
Yep.
And Richard supported his brother against Warwick and George.
So not only is this war pitted cousins against each other, it's now pitting brothers against each other as well.
Brothers of York.
So they were actually called the Three Sons of York, weren't they?
Yep.
And if you ever watch or read Shakespeare's play, I think it's is it Henry VI? I think, where they talk about the Three Sons of York. It was some supposed legend that at the Battle of Towton, 3 suns appeared in the sky to symbolise the 3 remaining sons of York.
Oh. I'm not entirely sure that is
artistic license.
Yeah. Somewhat. He did that a little bit, didn't he?
Especially when it comes to this particular family, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, Warwick then defected to Margaret of Anjou, and Richard and Edward were forced to flee to Burgundy in October 1470.
Yeah.
And this is where, for us personally, we get a little bit of excitement because they left from a particular port in a particular town.
What particular town would this be?
The one in which we live. It's called King's Lynn now, but at the time it was Bishop's Lynn because Henry VIII hadn't dissoluted the monasteries, so we were still Bishop's Lynn.
Yep.
And they fled from King's Lynn, and they nearly got caught by merchants of the Hanseatic League, and they first thought that they were pirates.
Just as you are the resident Lynbird here,
Can
you, for our audience, just explain what the Hanseatic League is?
So yeah, the Hanseatic League was actually started off with like German origins,
Alright.
and it was called Die Hanse, the Hands.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and King's Lynn was Great Britain's first member of it. It was then followed by Aberdeen, Edinburgh, Boston, and Hull, and they are currently the only other members from the United Kingdom. The Hands is an active network of towns and cities across Europe, which historically belonged to the Association of the Merchant Towns, known as the Hanseatic League.
Okay.
Yeah, so the original medieval Hanseatic League, which comprised of a group of towns around the Baltic and the North Sea.
Right.
And it was an extremely influential trading association and is very much part of King's Lynn's development and historic past. Because obviously at the time, especially back in the medieval times, even up as far as like Tudors and on, the Duke of Norfolk was like the next highest rank after the king, and King's Lynn was the most famous port. So it's actually got, King's Lynn is quite a historical place, and the Hanseatic League has put us on the map, so to speak.
That's cool. I never realised how like historical it was until I moved here, and now I love it. And I've barely seen. I've been here for 5 years now. Barely seen a fraction of it.
Yeah, I'm trying to show you some. Take
Yeah.
you to all my favourite places, but yeah,
Life gets in the way.
it does.
Right, back to the life that we're talking about.
Yes, Richard.
Way. Right, yeah, so they left from King's Lynn, nearly got caught by the Hanseatic merchants. Richard himself actually had to flee twice. The first time was with Edward, Anthony L. Rivers, and another one. I cannot remember his name. It will come to me. I want to say Thomas. I don't know. But the second time, Edward was actually captured and held at Warwick Castle in what is now called the Caesar Tower by Earl Warwick. And quite funnily, he ordered huge feasts and parties and everything at Warwick's expense, knowing that Warwick couldn't do anything. He couldn't refuse him because at that point he was still technically the anointed king. So yeah, he just completely went to town on that.
So many reasons why I love Edward the Fourth.
Yeah. But Richard he did a runner, and he actually fled over to Burgundy, where his sister Margaret was married to Charles the Bold, who was Duke of Burgundy. But he received a lot of help, including £20,000 to fund an army. £20,000 in the 1460s.
Wow.
70s, sorry. No, yeah, 70s. I mean, could you imagine that?
Not really. It's a lot of money.
It's an insane amount. But he got those and he returned, and then we had the two most decisive battles in the Wars of the Roses before the end. So these are the two of the most decisive ones in Edward's segment.
Okay.
And this is the Battle of Tewkesbury.
Yep.
And the Battle of Barnet.
Yep.
And Barnet came first, and that was where they came about the same time. Basically, what happened was there was a force led by Warwick, Margaret of Anjou, and Henry VI's son, Edward, Prince of Wales. They led the one side, and on the other side were Richard and Edward. And at the Battle of Barnet is where Warwick actually died. He was killed. The Kingmaker was killed at Barnet, because apparently he sent his horse away and refused to ride away. He decided to fight and die with his men. Quite commendable, in fairness. Richard, he fought in the vanguard at this, so he fought in like the lead army in this. He was 18.
Wow.
He also fought again in the vanguard at Tewkesbury, which is where Edward, Prince of Wales, son of Henry VI, was killed. So both decisive victories, and put an end to the rebellions. At that point, George came calling back, apologised, said please take me back, and his brothers did.
Because at the end of the day, they were brothers.
Yeah. Now, bear in mind, he did all this stuff young, but Richard suffered from idiopathic scoliosis.
Well, we know that purely
Yeah.
for the fact that, which you're going to speak about in more detail, but Shakespeare,
Yes.
when you think of Richard III, you think of a hump in his back. Extreme scoliosis.
Now is the winter of our discontent, with his limp arm and yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. But he, it wasn't actually that prominent, was it?
No, it could actually be disguised by clothing, so you couldn't really see it unless you looked directly at his back. He also used to wear armour that would hold him quite upright and quite rigid. He was, by all accounts, a very good soldier.
Yeah.
Very fierce fighter. And he didn't have a limp, unless you whacked his leg. Didn't have a hunchback. He was able to stand up tall. And his arm was all right.
He didn't have a withered arm.
He did not have a withered arm.
And that's actually proven in the television show where they actually found his bones.
Yeah. They did an interesting follow-up show to that where they got a young man who surprisingly looked a lot like him, actually, who had the same spinal deformity, and they got him to do some of the activities that Richard would have been involved in.
Put some armour on and ride a horse.
And you wouldn't tell.
No.
I mean, he ached, it caused him pain, but Richard would have been taught to deal with that pain, and they would have still had apothecaries and things that could have helped him.
Yep.
Maybe some opiates, you never know. So yeah, by all accounts, you'd look at him, you'd see him walking towards you, sword in hand, you wouldn't know.
No.
Not at all. So he was able to fight in these battles, and after Edward was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury, Edward was actually married to Anne Neville, Richard's other daughter.
So Richard III's betrothed, in inverted commas, before Edward said, "Nah, mate."
Yeah.
Married.
Yeah. Married Edward. It was part of a pact between Margaret of Anjou, who was Edward's mother, and Richard Neville. So in order to solidify their alliance, the two got married. They didn't have any children. Edward was killed, and Richard then married Anne.
Oh, so
he got there.
Edward let him.
Yeah.
See, Edward's a good guy.
I mean, George, Duke of Clarence, was not too happy about that. At the time, there was like a inheritance sort of thing that had been left by Richard Neville to his daughters. It was on the condition when their mother died. However, Edward overturned that and said that, to all intents and purposes, their mother, who was now hiding in sanctuary, she was dead as far as he was concerned legally. So they were entitled to it. But he wasn't too happy about the fact that Richard now had a claim being married to him. So Richard renounced most of Warwick's land and his property, and actually surrendered the office of Great Chamberlain of England to George to make him happy. So then George gave his blessing as well, and they were able to marry.
That is such, like, I know they're obviously like dukes and stuff, and they obviously is in a much grander scale. That is such a brother thing to do. Like, I don't know if you've ever done it with your brother. For my sisters, so many times have I just like gone for an easy life and said, "Fine, have it." Normally it's like a makeup or a hairbrush or whatever, not, land and titles. But how much of that is that a brotherly, "Fine, have it," just to keep you happy?
To be fair, makeup and hairbrushes, I did that with my brother as well. My brother looks better in a dress than I do.
True fact.
For festivals, I mean, not that I wouldn't be okay with it, but for festivals. But yeah, no, I see what you mean. It is a sibling thing. It's like, you know what? I want this. If you're going to kick up a fuss, have that, whatever. Just please let me have this.
Yeah, it's like, I don't care enough about the stuff you want, just have it.
Yeah. I mean, he got it back in the end anyway.
Well, obviously, yeah.
Spoilers. Whoops. I mean, it's history, guys. There's no spoilers here.
Well, no. So yeah, Richard married Anne, and they had one son. Well, he had one son with Anne, called Edward of Midland. But it is proven there could be more, but the ones that we know of, he has 3 illegitimate children.
Yes.
John of Gloucester, to an unknown mother, but possibly Alisburg or Catherine Hart. He was made Captain of Calais when Edward was invested as Prince of Wales on the 8th of September 1483.
That's Edward of Midland, that's his legitimate son.
So he acknowledged that he had these illegitimate children, but he always made sure that his actual son was obviously got everything first.
Yeah. I mean, he couldn't officially acknowledge him at first until
No.
he was king, but it was rumoured that these two women, Catherine Hort and Alice Berg, both got sizable pensions.
Oh.
So, convenient.
Yes. So John of Gloucester, obviously the illegitimate son, he was actually later arrested by Henry VII.
Yeah, it was part of the Perkin Warbeck plot,
Mm-hmm.
and it was actually mentioned in Perkin's confession or his memoir or something later on that John of Gloucester was detained at His Majesty's pleasure.
Oh.
So yeah, he was a prisoner. I'm not 100% certain whether he was executed or not, but yeah, he was detained and stripped of his title as Captain of Calais.
Oh, good.
He also had a daughter,
Oh.
Richard. He had Catherine Plantagenet, who possibly, we're not 100% sure, but she could possibly have been Catherine Hort's daughter. And she married the Earl of Huntingdon, who was later made Chief Justice of South Wales.
That's
because
cool.
Earl of Huntingdon's father was Earl of Pembroke.
Okay.
And then there was the third one, who was another son, not quite as fortunate as the other two.
No, Richard of Eastwell was a bricklayer. He claimed to be another illegitimate son, but it was never technically proven. But it was said that he was called to Richard's tent the night before the Battle of Bosworth,
Mm-hmm.
and Richard told him that, yes, I am your father.
Yeah, he told him to go and stand on a nearby hill and watch the battle, and if the battle went ill, to never again say that he was his son,
Wow.
to deny his inheritance. So he was looking after the kid. But he's like, if we win, you are my son. If we lose, you are just you.
That's actually really nice. When I first thought about that, I was like, arsehole. But actually he's saying, like, I'm telling you so you know, but if I die, I don't want you to be killed, so
Yeah.
you know, but no one else needs to. That's quite nice.
Yeah.
Good daddy.
Where the building that Richard of Eastwell actually lived in hasn't survived,
Okay.
obviously, but the place where it stood, there is now a building called Plantagenet Cottage,
Oh.
and there is actually a well in Eastwell Park that's named after him,
Oh.
which is quite cute.
It's quite a little honour to him.
Yeah, so obviously the people around believed it. So yeah. George. Let's go back to George here. Now, we did say earlier that Richard got his lands back.
He did.
What happened next is, unfortunately, Isabel, she wasn't the healthiest.
No.
She'd already had one miscarriage. She actually managed to carry 2 children full term and had them, Edward and Margaret. But then she became ill and she died. After her death, George, so distraught that he was, decided to try and make a marriage pact with Mary of Burgundy. However, he was denied. This was in 1477. George wasn't happy with this. He rebelled openly, cast some slander about, accused Elizabeth Woodville, who was Yorbay, Edward IV's wife, accused her of witchcraft, and he was then basically tried, convicted, and summarily executed for treason. We'll come back to that later.
Yes, we will.
So at that point, Richard got his lands back.
Yep. One thing a lot of people can say about Richard, because I think all we really remembered and all you're taught in school is the stuff that we can thank Shakespeare for.
Bad man,
Evil-
hunchback, princes.
And the princes, which we will talk about later. But he was very loyal to Edward. Obviously, showing how loyal he was when he wanted to marry Anne, and Edward said no at first. He was like, fine.
Yeah.
You've said no, you're the king, I'm loyal to you. But he was also a principal lieutenant, and may have led the vanguard at Barnet in his first command on the 14th of April 1471, and he outflanked the Duke of Exeter at this point.
So not only did he fight in the vanguard, so right up in the front, he outflanked a Duke who was older and had more battle experience.
Yeah.
It was his first command at aged 18.
Yeah, and he was his personal household lost men, so he was right in the thick of the battle.
Yeah, so it's not like he turned around, because your personal household would always stay with you wherever you were. So it's not like he sort of commanded from afar. He was right in there, in the blood and sweat, so to speak. He also, as I said earlier, he had the vanguard at Tewkesbury, and same thing. They found evidence of his personal household guard there. He was highly regarded in the north of England, particularly in York. Because obviously being from there, he spent a lot of his time in York, and he controlled the north of England until his brother's death, and they really did like him up there. One of the things he did was he set up the Council of the North to improve government control, and it also improved economic prosperity. And in 1472 he set this up, and he actually served as the first Lord President until his accession, and then he named his nephew John de la Pole as his successor.
Oh.
So if you're a Tudor buff, you know about the de la Poles.
Yes, you know about the de la Poles.
Yeah. And interesting enough, Margaret, who I just said was the daughter of Isabel and George, she married into the de la Pole family.
She did.
Which ultimately technically led to her death. That's your other bay, Henry VIII.
Yeah, well, I have. I only have two historical bays. Yours is obviously Richard. But to be fair, my Edward IV love began with a specific Irons.
With the betrayal by Max Irons in The White Queen, the TV show. I mean, to be fair, that is a good acting family, the Irons family. But no, it's a fantastic portrayal. If you ever get a chance to read the books or see the film or see the TV series, just be aware that Richard is portrayed as much older than he actually was.
And Edward IV is beautiful.
Well, Edward IV apparently was quite a looker anyway.
Obviously.
But, interesting enough, George was too. So was Richard. Apparently all three of them had fair hair and lovely bright eyes, and Richard, obviously, as we can see from his illegitimate children, could have his pick of the women.
Yeah, he was fertile, shall one say.
Yep. So we can blame Anne for that one.
Yeah, so but
controversial, sorry.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so back to the podcast.
Yes.
So you've said that during his battles he actually won the Royal Burgh of Berwick upon Tweed from Scotland, which was the last time it changed hands between them and England.
So there was a lot of border skirmishes at the time between England and Scotland. That lasted for pretty much up until the Stuart times. So to actually claim Berwick upon Tweed back was quite a big deal.
Yeah, definitely. But now,
your bay actually kind of fell flat with that one, though. He was supposed to have brought an army up from England to support them, and he didn't.
Didn't need him though. He had faith in your bay.
He had faith in little Richard. I nearly said little Dick then.
Wow.
Little Dicky boy. Yes, now
so,
that's sadness.
9th of April, 1483, Edward IV died. He was quite young.
He was quite young, but he was also very, very drunk, quite corpulent, and a bit of a womanizer.
A bit of a womanizer, yeah, but we're not going to talk about him. That's for another show.
Yeah.
So he passed away, and he had two children, Edward and Richard. Well, two male heirs.
He had more children.
And
lots of children.
Edward V succeeded him, but he was only 12 years old. And Richard was named Lord Protector according to his brother's last wishes.
Now, we've already established he's very loyal to his brother.
Very.
So he would have done it. And apparently it's one of the things that Richard was there and Lord Hastings was there as well. And it was proclaimed pretty much on his deathbed that Richard should be Lord Protector.
Yeah.
He left Yorkshire for London, and on the 29th of April, he and their cousin, the Duke of Buckingham, met Anthony Woodville, the second Earl Rivers, who was the brother of Elizabeth Woodville, the wife of Edward IV, or now widow of Edward IV.
Yeah.
He met them at Northampton whilst they were escorting the young king in waiting. Edward had already gone ahead. He was at Stony Stratford at that point. Richard had Anthony and his nephew Richard Grey and one of their associates Thomas Vaughan arrested because he was led to believe that there was a plot against him as Lord Protector, to remove him as Lord Protector. And he had been told by his brother, the former king, he had to be Lord Protector, so that's what he was going to do. He actually went with an army of 600 men, and the Woodvilles, despite their pleas that no, we're coming in peace, completely in peace, had 2,000 men and carts full of weapons. Didn't look good.
Well, no, but yes, Richard was being very loyal, but Edward hadn't told anybody else that this is what he was going to do. So if you're a mum with these two children, and you know they're going to be king, and that's their duty, that's their right, to then have Richard be like, oh, by the way, no one heard it, but he definitely told me I was going to be in charge, you'd probably wants some backup.
No, devil's advocate, I do understand that. But Richard, he took action. He arrested them. They were tried and then executed at Pontefract Castle on the 25th of June 1483 for treason.
Yeah, that 100% didn't prove that Elizabeth Woodville had any problems to worry about. Nope. Killing her brothers.
Her brother and her son.
Yeah, that totally proved that she had nothing to worry about.
Do you want to know the irony, though? Richard was actually appointed executor of the will of Anthony Rivers.
Wow.
So, yeah, Rivers had appointed him as executor, but then Richard actually killed him. Or had him killed.
And we're supposed to think he's a good guy?
He was decisive. That's one thing a lot of people say about him. He was always decisive. He wasn't rash, he wasn't impulsive, but he was decisive. If he had a choice, he would do it.
This kind of screams a little bit of desperation as well.
Well, yeah. I think he panicked a little bit because the Woodvilles had they'd spread a lot. I mean, the Plantagenet family is named after the Plantagenet weed, the Plantagenesis weed, but the Woodvilles were more of a weed because one of the first things that Elizabeth Woodville did after she got married to Edward IV was put a lot of her family in prominent positions, and it caused a lot of issues within the court, even within the brothers. Because the Woodvilles, it was just seen that she was looking after her own. It wasn't necessarily the best man for the job, it was her man for the job.
Yeah.
So he's had all this, the Woodvilles essentially in control of the throne for years and years, and then suddenly he has a chance to get out from under that, to get the kingdom out from under that, and to get his nephew as king into the right path, what he saw as a right path. I mean, he was a very strict, very stoic, very devout man, but also he was a huge fan, apparently, of the Arthurian legends and knights' honour and chivalry. So he wanted his nephew to be raised as king in that, rather than in the Woodville weed. So you can sort of, from that point of view, you can see how or why he would have acted like that. He wanted to get away. But by the same token, didn't do himself any favours with Elizabeth.
Yeah, no, not really. But Elizabeth obviously must have trusted him somewhat, because Richard escorted Edward V to London. Mm-hmm. He was then moved to the Tower of London's royal apartments to await his coronation.
Yeah, which was a common thing. You know, you'd stay in the Tower of London before you were crowned.
It was a prison, but it was also like a hotel.
Yeah, it was. You had the Royal Tower, the White Tower, and then like all the prisons around it. Elizabeth Woodville, however, she fled to sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. So obviously, she couldn't do anything for Edward at that point. She wanted to protect her other children. I think she had one of her brothers there and her daughters as well. And they went to Westminster Abbey. But this didn't sit well with Richard. He was worried, and he knew that she had more people in there than just her children. And he suspected that she was plotting his murder. That where her brother and son had failed, she was going to try and succeed. So he asked for help from Ralph Lord Neville, who was in Yorkshire at this time. But, I said that he had his support to Hastings. Didn't go well for Hastings.
Right.
Basically, at this point, Richard does become really quite paranoid.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of people, he thinks there's a lot of people out to get him. And whether or not you believe it was Buckingham dripping poison in his ear, we don't know. And unfortunately, we may never know. But there was a meeting at the Tower of London, possibly to discuss the Prince's coronation. And Hastings was there, and apparently at the start of it, Richard was he was happy, he was laughing, he was joking, drinking, everything was fine. And then a messenger came in and he went out. He came back in and he was quite on edge, quite tense. And then all of a sudden he exploded and accused Hastings and some of the others there of conspiring against him. And Hastings was taken outside and immediately executed without trial.
Oh, wow.
Now, that can scream of somebody who's panicking, who wants everything their way, and then one person who actually knows the truth, get rid of them. Because Hastings was in the room as well. Could be that. Or it could be that Hastings was one of his closest advisors, most loyal friends, and he's just heard that Hastings has betrayed him. That's, an act of passion, anger, betrayal. It's like, I can't bear to look at him, just do it. Just do it. Again, 50-50, we don't know.
No, we don't know.
What do you think?
Oh,
Putting you on the spot, sorry.
I think it was, I guess, kind of rash. Because you say closest friend, closest advisor, you'd give them the benefit of the doubt. I mean, I would you. If someone come in to me and said that you'd betrayed me, I wouldn't go, right, kill her.
You'd want an explanation.
You'd want an explanation. And I would be like, no, she wouldn't do that. She wouldn't do that to me. I've got to give her a chance to explain herself. And then possibly do it. But to go out and do it straight away, that kind of screams, like you said, paranoia, fear, possibly.
Trouble is, we have no idea what was actually said to him or maybe shown to him when he was outside, when he left that room for the short period. So what if it was something like incontrovertible proof that he knew for a fact, just looking at it, there was no way Hastings could deny it.
Still, as a friend, you might give them a chance to try.
True. I mean, it's both in and out of character for him. It's decisive, but at the same time, he's normally quite logical.
Yeah.
So it's a weird one. It would be so interesting if you get a time machine just to go out and stand outside the door.
Be a fly on the wall.
Yeah. Just kind of stay away from the axe. So yeah, that was on the 13th of June. This is still 1483. So he's killed the Woodvilles. Elizabeth is in hiding at Westminster Abbey. One prince is in the Tower, and Hastings is gone.
And he's been king for just over a year.
He hasn't even been king yet. He's still Lord Protector at this point.
He's been Lord Protector for over a year.
Yeah, this is it's all going well so far.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. However, as much as she didn't like him, this is where it gets a little bit weird on Elizabeth's side of things. So she's terrified that he's going to kill her son and take over the throne and blah blah blah. She gives him another son.
Did she?
She handed over on the 16th of June. She handed over young Richard, Duke of York. Although apparently in my notes I put Richard, Duke of York.
Fabulous.
Yep, Richard, Duke of York. She handed him over to the Archbishop of Canterbury so that he could attend his brother's coronation on the 22nd of June.
Did she though, or was it a pauper that had no family?
Oh, conspiracy!
Did Richard, Duke of York, actually be sent to France, Brussels, Burgundy?
Was he sent to Burgundy to live with his aunt, Margaret, and her family? Was he maybe sent to France to live with the captain of Calais?
It's all,
yeah.
But we should discuss Elizabeth at another day.
Yes.
So for the sake of this, we'll just assume that it was her actual legitimate son.
Yes, her
But
Richard, Duke of York.
Yeah, so she sent him so he could attend his brother's coronation on the 22nd of June. At this point, however, before the coronation, Richard was actually informed that the marriage of Edward IV and Elizabeth was illegal because Edward had already married Eleanor Butler.
Mm-hmm.
So it meant that Edward V and all of the other children were bastards. They were completely illegitimate.
Yeah, we have actually found out who supposedly told him that, haven't we?
We have.
Who was it? It's right there in the notes.
Robert Stillington. What a name.
The Bishop of Bath and Wells.
Bath and Wells.
Yes.
Is that a bath and a well, or the place Bath and Wells?
The place Bath, which contains baths, and the place Wells, which contains wells. So he is Bishop of Bath and Wells, and the Bishop of the Baths and the Wells. So, yeah, bit of both, really.
But yes, he told them that information, and so it wasn't kept a secret because nothing really ever really is. And the citizens of London drew up a petition to have Richard to assume the throne.
Now, when we say citizens of London, we don't just mean like the peasants, because majority of them couldn't read or write.
No.
These are like your nobles, your lesser nobles, so the people who had some say and some education.
Yeah, and because Richard, he wasn't a fool, he accepted this, and on the 26th of June, he was crowned at Westminster Abbey.
Yeah, he accepted it on the 26th of June, and then the coronation was on the 6th of July, wasn't it?
In 1483.
Yep. So everything's gone downhill. So when Edward died, it was just literally a matter of months before it all came to a head, and Richard was then crowned. in July 1483.
Yep.
So, I mean, yes, he seized the throne, technically, but the citizens of London asked him to do it. But I'm wondering where they got the evidence about Eleanor Butler. That would be interesting to find out how Stillington got that.
Or whether Richard just wanted some goss.
Yep. His right to the throne was actually confirmed by Parliament in January 1484 by a document called the Titulus Regius.
Of course.
Yep, because everything was in Latin, why not? The princes themselves, they were both still in the royal apartments in the tower. They were actually spotted for some time, played out in the gardens, wandering around. Then nothing. They vanish. Dun dun dun. Now, this is where the conspiracy theories come in. So, he wasn't actually fully accused until after his death, and his main accusers, let's be honest here, were Thomas More and Shakespeare. But there was a lot of rumours going around that Richard was behind it. However, there were also rumours that the Duke of Buckingham was behind it. Because he did a revolt, or he revolted against Richard, and it didn't really go well for him. This was in 1483. It was a couple of disaffected gentry, many of whom had actually been supporters of Edward IV and the Yorkist establishment. It was led by the second Duke of Buckingham, who was Henry Stafford. Remember the name Stafford?
Yeah.
It actually had begun as a Woodville-Beaufort conspiracy. Margaret Beaufort being Stafford's stepmother, and the mother of the future Henry VII, by Owen Tudor. Not particularly one of my favourite historical characters.
Margaret Beaufort.
I think I may have referred to her as a pious old goat at some point.
Many people do.
Yeah. She was of the firm opinion that it was her son's God-given right to be king and her God-given right to be Dowager Queen. And she would do anything she could to put him on the throne.
I mean, she made it happen.
She made it happen, but
Girl's got gumption.
She also helped bring about wars and brought the sweating sickness to England and infested the country with French mercenaries. So, yeah, she did great there. And to anyone who ever says that England did not have a Welsh king, Henry was Welsh. Also, they were descended from a bastard line, an illegitimate line of John of Gaunt, who legitimised his son through that relationship. But technically, according to the laws of the land, he should not really have held any title or any right to be king. It's only because Margaret and Warwick, etc., persuaded Henry VI to invest Henry Tudor as one of his heirs. Gumption maybe. Determination, yes, I'll give her that, but, still an old goat. Anyway, she'd actually conspired with Elizabeth Woodville at this point to try and remove Richard, and they got the Duke of Buckingham involved. And the idea was potentially to depose Richard and put Edward V back on the throne. But this is when the rumours arose that Edward and his brother were actually dead. Buckingham then proposed that Henry Tudor, Henry VII, should return from exile, take the throne, and then marry Edward and Elizabeth's daughter, Elizabeth of York, who he actually did end up marrying anyway.
Yeah, that actually happened.
This was actually... We should kind of treat that with caution, because apparently those words come from Richard III's Parliament in 1484. So it could be... This was after Buckingham was tried and executed for treason. So it could be that they're kind of spinning things to make it seem far worse than it actually was. But yeah, it didn't really go too well. Henry Tudor was actually in exile at this point in Brittany, and he had some support over there. and hoped that he would be able to, through an alliance with Brittany and his claim to the throne of England, make a successful claim there. He tried to come over at that point and start an invasion. However, there was a storm, and his ships couldn't leave Brittany and Normandy. So that was delayed. So Richard actually won himself an extra year on the throne just because of a storm. And there are so many times that things nearly happened if it wasn't for the British weather.
Armada.
Yep.
Armada. And Armada.
Yep. Yep. And Battle of Britain as well.
Yeah.
Remember the clouds. Yeah, so it didn't just affect Henry, however. He anchored himself. He actually managed to get across, Henry himself. His army was still over there, but he managed to get across and actually anchored in Plymouth. But then he learned of what had happened to Buckingham, because Buckingham's army were troubled by the same storm, and when Richard's forces came up against them, they left it. They deserted.
Obviously they did.
Yeah. So Buckingham tried to disguise himself and escape, because Richard had actually put a bounty on his head at that point. However, he was caught, and he was convicted of treason and beheaded in Salisbury, actually near the Bull's Head Inn, on the 2nd of November. His widow, Catherine Woodville, so he was married to the Woodvilles, that's how they had the alliance, actually married Jasper Tudor, who was Henry Tudor's uncle, and was the one that many allege Margaret Beaufort was actually in love with.
Yeah.
Yep, so Owen Tudor's brother, she actually married Jasper. Richard was quite clever about this, in fairness. He was very politically savvy. Once everything had failed, he actually then went to the people that had supported Henry over there, a guy called Pierre Landais, who was the treasurer in Brittany. Richard actually went over to him and spoke to him and offered him military support in exchange for Henry Tudor. Oh. Landais was going to do it, but Henry actually fled to Paris, and he got support from the regent there, who was Anne of Beaujeu, and she was the one that supplied him the troops for the invasion in 1485.
Oh, okay.
The French government, they sided with Richard in this and refused to help him, refused to give him a French pension, and they wouldn't have done it.
Oh, right, okay.
Okay.
Well, I know that you very much like Richard, and you very much don't like this topic, but you have slightly just glanced over the biggest thing that Richard III is known for.
Not his crook back.
Not his crook back.
Not his arm.
Not his arm.
Not his military savvy and political prowess. No,
the Princess in the Tower.
Oh, damn it.
Now, Carrie, a lot of people, and it's what you're taught in the school. It is, in fairness, I don't know how you were taught it, but when I was taught it, it was taught as a history mystery that we would never really know.
Oh no, we were taught it was fact.
No, we were taught that we'd never really know, and that given all of the evidence, and we had to kind of make our own minds up, to our own little I guess Cluedo. Like, who was it? The king in the tower with the pillow. But a lot of people do think Richard did it, and that, I guess, that is Shakespeare's fault, because Shakespeare did claim that he did.
Yeah.
But personally, I don't actually think Richard did it. I don't think that he did, and I personally don't even think he knew about it. We do have different opinions on that, but I do. The facts we have are the boys were seen, then they weren't.
Yep.
And then years later, bones under the stairs were found of boys of around both of their ages. But for whatever reason, the bones haven't been tested. They haven't done any DNA to find out who they were. There's not really any reason why.
The Queen, she said no.
Yeah, the Queen says no. That she obviously has a reason.
Yeah.
Some people probably see that as even more conspiracy that he did, because obviously that would be quite a big blow.
Yeah.
If we found out that they actually were. But I think even if we do find out that they were them, that still doesn't mean that Richard was a killer.
Well, no, I mean, and it also doesn't really shake the Queen's claim to the throne, because there were other events as well that would have changed the reigning monarchy anyways.
Yeah. What do you think happened to them?
I do think they were murdered.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a nice little idea that only one of them was actually a prince. I think it's quite a romantic little story, but I do think they were murdered. I don't think Richard knew about it. I 100% accept that he had the most to gain from it.
Yeah, it would have been if it was like, I don't know if it wasn't Richard, I guess, because people thought he was like a nice guy, but it made sense.
Yeah.
If he wanted to be king, he had to kill. If they hadn't been kids, everyone would have been like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. However, at the same time, he also had the most to lose.
Yeah.
Because by doing that, he would lose the support of everyone from the House of York within his household that he still had support from, and risked an uprising. And that was one thing he, up until this point, with everything he's done, he did everything in his power to stop an uprising.
Yeah.
Plus, at this point, his own son, Edward, had sickened and died.
Yeah.
Anne wasn't too far behind. Earlier in 1485, and he was. I mean, rumour was he was looking at Elizabeth of York, even though she was his niece, as a potential alternative.
Yeah.
But it was. He had a lot to lose, because worst case scenario, the Pope wouldn't grant a dispensation for him to marry Elizabeth. He would then be able to name Edward as his heir, so he'd be king until Edward came of age. You know, it's fair enough. I personally think that. I don't know whether he did it directly or someone did it in his name. I think it can be traced back to Henry VII. Because he was very, very quick to destroy everything about it. Like, he didn't officially investigate when he became king. He put on some sort of a show about it and said that it would be looked into, but he didn't actually full on investigate. Their bodies weren't found for many years, but if he'd have wanted to completely damn Richard, he could have found the body sooner. When you had the two pretenders, Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, he executed one, but kept the other one alive.
Yeah, he executed Perkin Warbeck, and he gave Lambert Simnel a job in the royal household.
No,
because Perkin Warbeck was older and Lambert Simnel was younger, so he didn't really know what he was doing.
No, but still, if you weren't sure that the princes were dead, if you had that slight inkling that they might be alive, wouldn't you execute them both? Unless you knew for a fact that they were dead, and that this kid standing in front of you was not one of them, so you might as well just give him a job in the kitchens.
Well, if that's what he really thought, he could have kept them both alive.
He could have done, but unless one of them was actually Richard. Which kind of lends credence to that. He knew that the one was Richard. But he stood to gain a hell of a lot as well, because by doing this, by spreading the rumours very, very quickly that Richard had killed the princes, that Richard was this bad guy, then he solidified his own claim and was like, oh yeah, look at me, I was right to do this. I mean, look at him, he's a child killer, he's a Kinslayer, he's terrible, you know, look what he's done. You know, he killed the Kingmaker. They poisoned his own wife. You know, things like that. And it's stuff that then later was translated by Thomas More into fact, and then by Shakespeare through Tudor propaganda into play, to obviously please the Tudors at the time. But it's one thing that I don't think we'll ever know for certain until we actually examine the bones.
I still don't even think that would help, because
no, it won't tell us who killed them.
I don't think Henry VII had anything to do with it.
Okay.
I think it was his wife. I think it was Anne Neville.
Okay.
I think she was so pissed at Elizabeth Woodville and devastated at the loss of her own child that she wanted to stay in power and also wanted to hurt Elizabeth. So I think Richard had no idea. I think that Anne Neville ordered the murders of the princes in the Tower.
It's one thing we agree on is that Richard didn't have any idea.
I don't think he did, because I don't think he would have done it.
No, he was. everything up until that point indicated too much that he loved his brother, and he was so loyal to his brother. So why, even for the sake of a crown, why would he then do that?
Because in his eyes, he was only doing what his brother wanted.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, at the Battle of Bosworth, where Richard was killed, around the area where he's believed to have died, there have been traces of armour and badges and things that show the Sun in Splendour. And the Sun in Splendour was Edward IV's sigil. So if he killed the princes in the tower and was such an evil guy and completely decimated the memory of his brother, why would his men be fighting for him? And why would they be fighting so close to him to keep him alive?
Yeah, it was Anne Neville. That's what I think.
We better get to work on that time machine, haven't we?
We should. We need to find out.
Yeah. Anyone has a time machine out there, hit us up. We'll be more than happy to give that a whirl.
Yeah, come on, Jodie, come and get us.
Yeah, other time machines are available. Just putting that out there if you happen to own a DeLorean. Right, so yeah, now on to the Battle of Bosworth.
Yes.
Spoilers, didn't go well for Richard.
It wasn't his finest hour.
No. But although by all accounts he did fight very valiantly at it.
It wasn't really his fault. He was betrayed.
He was betrayed. Well, when I said about Stafford, there was two brothers, and one of them was married to Margaret Beaufort, and they were supposedly on the side. One was always on each side in a battle, so whatever happened, they would always come out on top. And one supported Henry, and the other one supported Richard. However, at the Battle of Bosworth, they stayed back. So when Henry's forces came in and went for it, they just stopped and watched. And it was a case of whoever was the winner, they were back.
Yeah.
And when things started to get a little bit hairy for Henry, they came down on Henry's side and won. Now Richard, you'd think, considering his how things happened with Earl of Warwick, he would learn not to do this. He actually sent his horse away so that he could fight in with his men.
You mean he didn't say a horse? My kingdom for a horse?
No. Do you want to guess who said that? Shakespeare, of course. Yeah, that was something that Shakespeare said, but he didn't actually say that. His last words were actually quite stirring, quite epic. He'd sent his horse away, and he wanted to fight with his men. He wanted to be remembered. His words when he was offered to flee the battlefield said, "God forbid I yield one step. This day I will die as a king or win." And when he spotted Henry Tudor's standards, instead of fleeing, he charged towards him with his mounted cavalry, about 200 men, wearing the crown over his helmet. So instead of turning and running, he ran at him.
Yep, he had some balls.
I mean, in fairness, those are pretty epic, battle words.
They are. But then he was killed, stripped, and paraded stark bollock naked through the town on horseback.
Yeah, through the town of Leicester.
Spears stabbed into his butt.
Yes, and his head also smacked on a rock on the way in.
Yes.
He was dead at that point.
Yeah, it's not exactly the most dignified of... I think no matter what happened, he was a king of England.
Yeah.
He deserved a bit more respect than that.
Absolutely. And according to some of the analysis that was done on his bones after they found him in the car park in Leicester, in Greyfriars, because he was actually buried at the friary there, they found evidence of hammer poles and things being driven into his skull, blunt and sharp force trauma across the body. So he'd been hacked pretty much to death at that point in the middle of battle, and he put up quite a good fight, judging by some of his wounds. So he would have been beaten and bloody anyway, and then to have his buttocks stabbed and to be openly mocked by the people who he was essentially fighting for to keep them English. So it's a bit harsh. I mean, whatever you think of the man, whether you like him or not, that's no way to treat her. That's just disrespectful.
Yeah, definitely. So, last question to ask you before we go on to our ridiculous death, Carrie.
Yes.
Do you think he should have been buried where he was buried? Obviously, his body was found in the car park.
Yes.
And he was buried where?
He's actually buried in Leicester Cathedral now.
Yeah, do you think that he should be there? Do you think he should be Westminster Abbey? Or do you think he should have been taken home?
See, I get why they buried him at Leicester. And I think the way they did it, the whole ceremony and everything.
Oh, yeah, that was really cool.
It was so cool. It was really respectful. And it was fantastic to watch as well because it was history in the making. It was quite emotional, actually. Everything that they did was brilliant. But for his sins, he was still an anointed King of England. And he should have been buried in Westminster Abbey. He should have been buried near the brother that he loved so much. And he should have been buried with his wife. Whether or not they saw eye to eye at the end, they were still husband and wife, it was still the idea. However, had he been... There would be some fuss about that, and I'm not entirely sure the monarchy would overly approve.
Yeah, that's why I personally think he should have gone to York.
Yeah, I think York would be the
I
second
think he
choice.
should have gone to York.
Because it was his home at the end of the day, wasn't it? It was where he was born.
And if he was going to be moved anywhere, it should have just been, into York.
Yeah. Although... No. York, yeah. York would be a good
You were
option.
having to think, weren't you?
Yeah, I was having to think, but I was just about to say, because he had quite a lot of... London, because he was king, he didn't spend that much time in London, so maybe Westminster Abbey wouldn't be the best idea for him, so somewhere up north. But he has links all over the country.
Well, yeah.
So I think Leicester was nice and respectful. I get that.
Yeah, I get why they did Leicester, like why it was Leicester and stuff.
But no, it should have been York.
That's what I personally think so.
Yeah. I still haven't actually been to his grave.
That's odd.
I've been to the Bosworth battlefield, which is always worth a visit, by the way. I've been there, but I haven't yet been to his tomb at Leicester Cathedral.
Oh.
I've driven around Leicester loads of times, and, mostly because I'm lost on the way to Birmingham. And I do remember when Leicester won the cup, and they actually put a Leicester scarf around his statue.
Oh.
Which was pretty cool. But
yeah, that is Richard III in quite a long nutshell.
Well, we did say we'd do a long one tonight, didn't we?
Yeah, because unfortunately we didn't do one last week due to the fact that my family were holding a charity event in aid of Prostate Cancer UK and Breast Cancer UK.
Which went fantastic.
On Saturday. And last week was just all consumed by it, and we just did not have any time whatsoever to record a podcast for you all.
It was
so
chaos.
We do apologise, but I do believe that it was a good excuse. As excuses go for not doing one, I believe it passes as being an okay one.
Yeah, it was worth it. It was for a charitable cause.
It was.
And we're back.
To ridiculous deaths.
Yes.
Yes. So this one I think is quite ridiculous. Whether it happened or not is not 100%, but it's rumoured by enough people that it did happen. So you said back in the beginning, midway through the podcast, about George, the Duke of Clarence.
Yes, good old Georgie boy.
He was executed.
Yes.
Right.
Because he was a bit of a twit.
He was. This is because after his wife died, like you said, in 1476, he sought to wed Mary, the Duchess of Burgundy.
Yeah.
Edward objected to that match, and so the Clarence began scheming against his brother. Because scheming against the king is always a good idea.
Yeah, especially when that king is a battle-tested, 3-time
he never lost.
winning.
He never lost because he died of, overindulgence, pretty much.
Yeah.
So Edward then became convinced that Clarence was aiming for his throne, which he was. He was wanting the throne.
He made no secret
And so he was thrown in prison.
Okay.
In January 1478, the king unfolded the charges against his brother to Parliament.
Mm-hmm.
He had slandered the king and had received oaths of allegiance to himself and his heirs and had prepared for a new rebellion. Both houses of Parliament passed a bill of attainder and he was sentenced to death. And that would be followed. His death was secretly carried out at the Tower of London on the 14th 18th of February, 1478.
Well, yeah, they wouldn't want to make it a public spectacle because he was still their brother at the end of the day.
Yep, so that doesn't sound anything ridiculous about that.
No, sounds quite sad, actually.
George had a particular dislike for his sister-in-law.
Good old Elizabeth.
Yes, he didn't like her at all.
No.
So he was sentenced to be executed.
Mm-hmm.
So he asked to be, rather than be beheaded, he asked to be drowned.
Not a nice way to go.
He asked to be drowned in Malmsey wine. Malmsey wine.
Mm-hmm.
Which was Elizabeth Woodfield's favourite wine.
It's actually quite a nice sweet wine.
So, his last act of defiance as a human being, let alone a duke, brother of a king.
A prince, technically.
Yep, he had himself drowned in his sister-in-law's favourite wine.
So it's kind of like a big middle finger up. It's like, I'm drowning in this. I'm going out on a high like this. You can't drink it. Ha ha ha.
Pretty much.
Wow.
Yep.
I wonder how she took that.
I don't know. Probably. I don't know. I think it'd be more of an insult. I think she would have taken it more of an insult.
It depends on what depiction of Elizabeth Woodville you believe. If you believe like the wife of the king and, oh my god, this is terrible, how could he do this to me? Or do you believe if you drowned in the wine, give us a glass kind of Elizabeth? It's... But yeah, either way, it was a middle finger up to her.
It really was.
So even in death, he flicked to the bird.
He did.
So yeah, that was our ridiculous death.
Yes, and that was this week's podcast.
It was indeed.
It was. But this week we are going to do a shameless plug.
We are indeed. Shameless plug, imminent, and go.
We have some friends who have a podcast.
We have friends.
Yep, we have plugged for them previously on our Halloween episode. But we're doing it again. This week, it's obviously the ManNic Podcast.
Yeah.
They are they're playing a game.
Right.
2 truths and 1 lie.
Ooh.
And they've also got a quiz where they're going to be talking about the new season of Doctor Who and The Walking Dead. And possibly, I'm not 100% sure, but as they're a geek podcast and the new trailer of Avengers dropped this week, there may be a little discussion possibly about that. But yeah, check out the ManNic Podcast, and for anything geeky that tickles your fancy. So we're going to be back with the next couple weeks. Will be slightly themed around the 25th of December.
What day is that then?
You'll find out. Hey! Thank you very much, and we'll speak to you next Tuesday.
And tune into the ManNic Podcast, which is the word hits the web. It's available anyway from 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, which is Tuesday morning. Yeah, I can't get my words out. I'm going to go to bed. Good night.